The wind howled through the trees as the cabin door creaked open. The snow was thick outside, swallowing up the faint sound of footsteps. A group of 4 figures, clad in dark clothing and masks, crept toward the secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, their movements as silent as the falling snow. "Stay sharp, guys," said the leader, a young man named Troy, his breath misting in the cold air. "This place is isolated. No one's going to hear them scream." They had scouted the area for days, learning everything they needed to know about the cabin and its only inhabitant, an old man who lived alone in the woods, far from the nearest town. They had heard rumors about him, rumors about his past, about the treasure he kept hidden inside the cabin. But to the gang, he was just another soft target, a vulnerable old man with no chance of fighting back. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. "What's the plan again?" asked Sarah, one of the gang members, her voice low, barely audible against the wind. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder, glancing nervously at the other 3. "We hit the back first, cut the power, then get in," Troy said, his voice steady. "Quick and clean, in and out. The old man won't know what hit him." The group approached the cabin cautiously, the icy ground crunching under their boots. They moved swiftly, expertly, as if this were just another heist, just another easy score. The door was locked, but they had come prepared. Sarah quickly pulled out a crowbar, prying the door open with ease. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the only light coming from the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The smell of old wood and tobacco hung in the air, a reminder of the lonely existence the old man had lived here for years. They spread out quickly, the gang moving silently through the small house, their eyes scanning for anything valuable: gold, cash, weapons, anything that could fetch a good price. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies, pictures of a man who looked like he had spent his life in the military, standing tall beside young men who wore the same uniform. "This place is a dump," said Mark, the smallest member of the gang, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Where's the stash?" Troy didn't answer. He had seen the man's age in the pictures and assumed that whatever was inside this cabin would be easy pickings. Upstairs, they found a wooden door that creaked open with a soft groan. The room inside was bare, just an old wooden desk, a small cot, and a shelf of worn-out books. But it was what was on the desk that caught their attention, an old, tattered military jacket, the kind a Marine Recon would wear. It was covered in patches, each one symbolizing a mission, a deployment. Troy's eyes narrowed. Marine Recon? Interesting. A chill ran through the room as Sarah picked up a photo from the desk, dusting it off with her gloved hand. It was a picture of an older man in full military gear, standing proud with a group of soldiers, a younger version of the old man in the cabin. "Looks like we picked the wrong house," she muttered, the realization hitting her like a punch to the gut. "You said he was just some old guy," Mark said, his voice betraying a touch of fear. Troy didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed a set of keys hanging from the wall and turned back toward the stairs, signaling to the rest of the group. "No matter who he is, we're here for one thing. Let's finish this." But as they made their way downstairs, the floorboards suddenly creaked beneath them. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Troy's hand shot to his gun, the others following suit. Something was off. A low growl came from the corner of the cabin. They spun around, and there, standing in the doorway, was the old man himself, Jack Harding, a man well into his 70s, his face weathered by years of isolation and combat. He didn't look frail. In fact, he looked more like a predator than prey. His sharp eyes met theirs, calculating, and he stood completely still, his posture still straight and imposing. "You shouldn't have come here," Jack said, his voice gravelly but clear, each word like a warning. The gang froze, their eyes wide, realizing for the first time that they were not dealing with an old man at all. They were dealing with someone who had lived a lifetime of war, a former Marine Recon legend who had spent his youth in the heat of battle, surviving the world's most dangerous missions. The same man they thought would be an easy target was now standing in front of them, a calm fury emanating from his stance. "Put the guns down, or things will get messy," Jack added, his eyes narrowing slightly. Troy swallowed hard, adrenaline pumping through his veins. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had come here thinking they'd walk away rich, thinking they could overpower an old man without issue. But now, they were facing a legend, someone who had been trained to kill, to survive in the harshest environments. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. "We're not here for trouble. Just hand over whatever you've got, and we'll be gone." Jack's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "You don't know who you're dealing with. No one takes what's mine." The gang looked at each other, and it was clear they were no longer sure who had the upper hand. They had broken into this cabin, expecting an easy score, but they had just entered the den of a man who had lived through more violence than they could ever imagine. They were out of their depth, and now they would have to face the consequences. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Jack took one slow step forward. The gang, now frozen in fear, watched as the former Marine's movements seemed calculated, deliberate. He hadn't even reached for his weapon, because he didn't need to. They had walked right into a trap. The sound of clicking locks echoed through the room as Jack began to move with the speed of someone far younger. And as the first gang member raised his gun, Jack had already disarmed him, the gun skittering across the floor. A well-placed strike took down the second gang member before he even had time to blink. "What the hell is this guy?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking as he stared at Jack with wide eyes, the reality of the situation sinking in. But it was too late. The Marine Recon legend had already taken control, and now they were his prey. The predator had become the one who was hunted, and the gang realized all too late that they had picked the wrong cabin. As the gang members struggled to regain their bearings, the reality of their situation set in. They had been ready to rob a frail old man, to take what didn't belong to them, but instead, they found themselves face to face with a trained killer. A man who had lived through wars, survived brutal missions, and learned how to take down enemies far more dangerous than they ever could be. Jack Harding didn't waste any time. The moment he disarmed the first gang member, his movements were fluid, precise. His experience was evident in the way he reacted, instinctively moving to incapacitate them one by one. The old man was far from frail. He was a force to be reckoned with. Troy, the leader of the gang, was the first to regain his composure. He reached for his gun, trying to aim it at Jack, but before he could even get a shot off, Jack was already on top of him. In an instant, Troy's arm was twisted behind his back, his gun falling to the floor with a clatter. The force of Jack's grip caused Troy to cry out, but the old man didn't flinch. "You really thought you could just waltz in here?" Jack growled, his voice low and commanding. "You made a mistake, kid." The others, stunned by how quickly the situation had turned, hesitated. They were too scared to act, too shaken to even think clearly. Jack, meanwhile, was already assessing their every move, anticipating their fear, using their hesitation to his advantage. Mark, the youngest of the gang, tried to make a run for it, but Jack was already 2 steps ahead, his legs pumping as he closed the distance between them in seconds. With a swift motion, Jack grabbed him by the collar and pulled him into a chokehold, forcing Mark to the ground in an instant. The others watched, helpless, as Jack worked with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "You should have picked a different target," Jack muttered, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. As Sarah, the only woman in the gang, looked around, she could see the fear in the eyes of her partners. Their confidence was gone. What had started as a simple robbery had turned into a nightmare, and now they were trapped in Jack's world, a world where everything had been calculated, where every corner of the cabin had been prepared for a fight. "We're not here to kill you, man," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We didn't know who you were. We thought you were just an old guy, just a nobody." Jack's gaze never wavered. "You think your life means more than mine? You think I don't know what it's like to be underestimated? To have people write you off? I've seen it all, sweetheart, and I'm still standing." He released Mark from the chokehold, and the young man gasped for breath, his chest heaving with panic. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling as he tried to push himself back from Jack. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin was small, and they were trapped. Jack turned towards Sarah, his eyes calculating. "You want to walk out of here alive? Start by doing what I say." There was no hesitation this time. She slowly dropped her weapon, her hands raised in surrender. The rest of the gang followed suit, their weapons clattering to the floor. It was a turning point. They realized they had nothing left to fight with. They were no longer the ones in control. The moment they stepped foot in that cabin, they had signed their own fate. "Sit down," Jack ordered, his voice like steel. The gang, all of them now disarmed, sat on the floor of the cabin, still processing what had just happened. They were alive, yes, but they were at Jack's mercy now. And Jack Harding wasn't the type of man who showed mercy easily. For the next few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling in the fireplace, the wind howling outside, and the occasional nervous breath from the gang. Jack moved about the cabin, methodically retrieving his gear from hidden spots, preparing for whatever was next. "You came here for money, right?" Jack asked, his back turned to them as he pulled a duffel bag from underneath the bed. "But you won't find anything worth your while in here. You want cash? You want valuables?" He turned to face them, his eyes sharp. "That's not what I have to offer." The gang was confused, their minds still fogged from the shock. "What do you mean?" Troy asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jack smiled grimly. "You came into the wrong place. This cabin, this life. It's not for people like you, people who take without understanding what it costs. But I've been training people like you for years." He dropped the duffel bag onto the table with a heavy thud. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Jack's eyes narrowed. "I used to run missions, special ops. And when you train for that kind of work, you learn one thing above all else. Never underestimate your opponent." The gang sat in stunned silence, their hands still raised, their hearts pounding. They were facing a man who had spent his entire life in the kind of war they couldn't even imagine, and they had just walked into the middle of it. "I should have killed you all," Jack said finally, his tone low, "but I'm not the person I was. I've got a better way of handling things. You're not the enemy I fought in combat, but you sure are close." The gang members shifted uneasily, realizing that they hadn't just chosen the wrong house. They had picked the wrong man to mess with. The Marine Recon legend was still very much alive in this cabin, and he wasn't about to let them walk away unscathed. Jack looked them over one last time. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice hard. "You'll leave now, and I won't contact the authorities. You'll walk out of here and never come back, or I will make sure the whole world knows who you are." Troy stood up slowly, his knees shaking, as the gravity of the situation began to settle in. "You're letting us go?" Jack's cold smile returned. "Consider it a warning, a gift, if you will." The gang didn't need another word. One by one, they turned and bolted for the door, scrambling to get out of the cabin. They were terrified, but most of all, they were relieved to be leaving with their lives intact. Jack stood in the doorway, watching them flee into the night. He didn't chase them. He didn't need to. He had already won. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the wind now howling through the trees like a warning to anyone who dared enter the woods. Jack Harding stood tall, his back straight, his eyes scanning the horizon. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He was the one who had survived. And the world had just learned that it wasn't a good idea to mess with the wrong person. The gang bolted from the cabin, scrambling through the snow, their breaths visible in the freezing air. They were terrified. Too terrified to look back. They had barely escaped with their lives. Jack Harding, the old man they had come to rob, was no ordinary victim. He had wiped the floor with them in a matter of minutes, and now they were running from a man they realized they should have never crossed. But as they ran into the woods, the sting of their failure was all-consuming. What started as a simple heist, an easy target, had turned into something they couldn't even comprehend. The darkness of the night felt heavier now, their footsteps loud against the silence of the snow-covered ground. Troy, the gang leader, was the first to speak as they stumbled into the woods, trying to put distance between themselves and the cabin. "What the hell just happened?" he gasped, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. His heart was still racing. "That old man!" He was some kind of goddamn legend. Mark, still wide-eyed and shaken, glanced back over his shoulder as if expecting Jack to be right behind them. "You're telling me that guy was in Recon? Marine Recon?" He shook his head. "No way we were getting out of there alive." "Shut up and keep moving," Troy snapped, his voice tense. "We need to get back to the van. This is a disaster. We barely got out." They had no idea how Jack had moved so quickly, how he had so easily subdued them. They thought they had the advantage, a quiet, easy break-in. But that man, that former Marine, had completely dismantled their plan. Now, all they could do was run, hoping he didn't follow. Back at the cabin, Jack stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the woods. The storm outside raged, snowflakes whirling in the air, but Jack was unfazed. He had dealt with far worse conditions. He wiped his hands clean of any dirt, his military instincts still sharp. The danger was over for now, but he knew this wasn't the end. Those gang members didn't know it yet, but they were now part of something far bigger. Their failed heist was only the beginning. The gang they worked for, the one that had sent them to rob him, would eventually come looking for answers. And Jack, having lived through countless life or death situations, was prepared for whatever came next. The old man closed the door to the cabin, sealing himself back into the warmth of his small, solitary refuge. He walked back to the fireplace, the crackling flames casting an eerie glow in the otherwise dark room. His instincts told him this was just a warning shot, a test to see if he was vulnerable. But they were wrong. They didn't know the full extent of who he was, who he had been. Jack had spent years hiding in plain sight, far from the life he had once lived. The memories of his time in Marine Recon were still sharp, but he had buried them, he thought for good. He had chosen isolation, far away from the world that had broken him. But now, with the gang's failure, his past had come roaring back. And Jack was more than ready to face it. The next morning, Jack stood in the kitchen, making himself a simple breakfast. Eggs, coffee, a far cry from the high-stakes meals he had eaten during his military days. But today, there was a new urgency in his movements. As he finished his coffee, he picked up the radio receiver from the corner of the kitchen counter. He turned it on, the static hissing briefly before a crackling voice came through. "Jack," the voice said, "we've been tracking the situation. You weren't the only target. This is bigger than just some random break-in." Jack's face hardened. He knew exactly who was on the other end, a former colleague from his military days, someone who still had connections to the world he had left behind. "I figured as much," Jack replied, his voice steady. "The gang that tried to rob me, they're not just petty thieves, they're working for someone bigger." "That's right, and they're going to want answers. You've made a few enemies, Jack. They don't take kindly to failure." "I know," Jack said, his jaw tightening. "They'll come, but this time, they'll be sorry." Meanwhile, back in town, the gang had retreated to their hideout. The adrenaline of the heist still pulsed through their veins, but now they were faced with the aftermath. They had failed, and the truth was undeniable. They had picked the wrong target. Troy sat at the center of their hideout, pacing back and forth, his mind racing. They had underestimated the old man. But who the hell had he been? A Marine Recon legend? What did that even mean? "Why don't we just go back?" Mark suggested, his voice shaky. "We could try again. Maybe this time we can—" Troy cut him off. "Are you out of your mind? The man nearly killed us. We're lucky we got away with our lives. We're not going back to that cabin." Sarah, the only one in the gang who seemed to retain some sense of reason, shook her head. "Troy's right. We can't go back. We need to lay low." But as the minutes dragged on, an uneasy silence settled in. None of them felt safe. They knew the gang they worked for would demand answers. They had failed a mission, and the consequences for that kind of failure were never light. The question was no longer about who had sent them. It was about what Jack Harding would do next. That afternoon, Jack stood outside his cabin, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. His thoughts drifted back to his time in Marine Recon, when he had been part of an elite team sent on missions that seemed impossible. Those missions were nothing like the quiet life he had built for himself in these woods, but they were never far from his mind. He had always known, deep down, that his past wouldn't stay buried forever. He had tried to leave it behind, to escape it. But now, with the gang's failed attempt on his life, it was clear. The past had found him. As the snow began to fall again, Jack turned away from the view. He had a plan to make. He couldn't stay here, waiting for the storm to pass. It was time to confront the ones who had sent the gang after him. They would soon learn what it meant to mess with a Marine Recon legend, and they wouldn't be walking away this time. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the soft whistling of the wind and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Jack Harding stood by the window, his eyes scanning the thick snow-laden trees surrounding his isolated home. The air felt heavy, as if the storm outside was just the beginning of something more, something bigger. His phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a familiar voice on the other end. It was a warning. "Jack, they're coming," the voice on the line said. "They've already started sending people after you. You need to move. They're not going to stop." Jack's face was cold as he listened, his fingers brushing the edges of his old military jacket, a relic of his past. A past he had long since tried to bury, but it seemed that his enemies weren't finished with him, not by a long shot. "I know," Jack replied calmly, his voice tinged with quiet determination. "I've been expecting them." As soon as he hung up, he began to move, his movements efficient and calculated. Marine recon instincts kicked in, the old training taking over as he began to prepare for what was coming. He moved quickly but quietly, making sure the cabin was secure, that there were no loose ends. His weapons were already placed in easy reach, and the emergency supplies he had kept for years were packed. The storm outside intensified, but Jack didn't let it distract him. He knew what he had to do. The old man they underestimated was ready to teach them all a lesson. Meanwhile, the gang that had tried to rob him was in full damage control mode. They had barely escaped with their lives, but they were still alive, and that meant they had to answer for their failure. Back at their hideout, the tension was palpable. Troy was pacing back and forth, his thoughts racing. "What the hell are we going to do?" he muttered under his breath. His hands trembled as he lit another cigarette. "This wasn't supposed to happen. We're not supposed to fail. That old man, he wasn't just some washed-up vet. He was a freaking monster." Sarah sat silently, her head in her hands. She couldn't get the image of Jack out of her mind, his cold, calculating eyes and the way he moved. It was like he had never been the victim in his life. It was like he had been waiting for someone to come at him. "I'm telling you, man," Mark said, his voice desperate. "He's going to come for us. We don't even know who the hell we're messing with." Troy shot him a look. "Shut up, Mark. We know what we're dealing with now. We'll handle it. But we need backup. We need people who know how to handle themselves." Back at the cabin, Jack took a deep breath, pulling the heavy coat around his shoulders. He could feel the weight of what he was about to face. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was a familiar name, his old commander. "Jack, you still there?" the voice asked, familiar but urgent. "This isn't just about some petty gang anymore. They've got connections. People who know how to track and kill." Jack exhaled slowly, the cold air swirling around him. "I'm aware, but they made the mistake of thinking I was done. I'll make sure they understand just how wrong they were." The storm outside was growing worse, the blizzard closing in on the cabin. But Jack didn't flinch. He grabbed his gear and checked his weapons one more time. He knew they were coming. The people who wanted him silenced, the ones who had been hunting him for years. They were about to get the fight of their lives. He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his way toward the edge of the forest. It was only a matter of time before the gang sent their reinforcements, but Jack wasn't worried. He had been in far worse situations, surrounded by enemies who had underestimated him. This time, he was the one doing the hunting. Hours later, the sound of snowmobiles reached Jack's ears. He paused, listening as the distant rumble grew louder. He could see their headlights now, cutting through the snowstorm like a pair of eyes in the dark. They were here. Jack crouched low, his body hidden in the snow, barely making a sound. He could hear the wind howling around him, the heavy whir of the engines as the gang approached. He was ready. As the first snowmobile neared, Jack sprung into action. With the precision of a trained soldier, he moved like a shadow through the blizzard, quick, deadly, and efficient. He disarmed the first man before he even knew what hit him. The second man had no time to react before Jack had him on the ground, incapacitated. The third and fourth men were a little faster, but it didn't matter. Jack had the advantage. He had spent a lifetime in the deadliest environments, and they didn't stand a chance. Within minutes, the snow was stained red, and the gang members who had once thought they were in control were lying unconscious or worse, scattered in the snow. Jack stood over them, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes cold but unblinking. "This is your last warning," Jack muttered to the snow, as if the words were meant for the people who had sent these men after him. "Stay out of my way."